All right, so today we're going to step inside the courtroom, but we're going to look at it in a totally different way. Not as some neutral stage where justice is served, but as a system with a really deep structural history. A history that suggests the law didn't just evolve to protect people, it evolved to protect capital.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start by unpacking the law's quiet, built-in bias. Then, we'll look at how contract and tort law work as a shield and a sword for capital. After that, we'll trace the history of property itself, examine our two-tiered justice system through the lens of bankruptcy, and finish up with the ultimate expression of capital's power, the corporation.
You know, this quote really nails the heart of what we're talking about today. The legal system is fantastic at dealing with a fender bender or a small claims dispute. But what about the big stuff? What happens when the harm isn't just a one-off event, but a massive, systemic problem like wage theft or environmental pollution? Well, that's exactly the question we're digging into. So let's get right into it and pull back the curtain on this idea of the law's quiet bias. And like the subtitle says, the argument here is that this isn't some kind of bug or a mistake in the system. It's a core feature. It was designed this way from the very start.
We all have this image of Lady Justice, right? Blindfolded, holding the scales. Fair and balanced. But if you look at the historical reality, it tells a very different story. From its very earliest days, the law has been a battlefield, and it was shaped, very specifically, to safeguard ownership. This isn't just some fringe theory. Critical legal scholars have been arguing for decades that the system doesn't just get influenced by money, it actively reproduces the power that money creates.
Let's just keep this question in our minds as we go through this. Because if the courtroom is a kind of theater, you have to ask, what's the play being performed here? And, more importantly, who is it being performed for? Thinking about it this way really helps us start to pick apart that powerful myth of a totally neutral legal system.
Okay, so let's move on to our first big example of how this all works in practice. We're going to look at two huge pillars of civil law, contract law and tort law, and see how they act as the shield and the sword for this property-first system.
Now, this slide reveals something pretty fascinating. On one hand, you have contract law. That's the shield. It's built on this idea, this legal fiction, that two equal parties are freely making a deal. But in reality, it often papers over huge power imbalances. And on the other hand, you have tort law. That's the law of civil wrongs, things like negligence. This acts as the sword. But it's a very particular kind of sword, one that's designed to only see individual specific harms. That means it's basically blind to systemic problems like pollution or widespread wage theft. So you have one side that binds the weak and another that absolves the powerful.
And this isn't just abstract legal theory, right? This is stuff that shows up in our lives every single day. Just think about it. Wage theft is a massive multi-billion-dollar problem, but it's almost always treated as a civil issue. Meanwhile, spray painting a wall is a crime. And when was the last time you actually read all the terms and conditions before you clicked accept? That freedom of contract is pretty much an illusion. It's more like consent under pressure.
And listen, this isn't some new radical critique. Here you have a Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., saying this over 100 years ago. He recognized that under capitalism, the threat of unemployment or eviction is a form of coercion just as powerful as any physical threat. The contract just formalizes it. To really get why things are this way, you have to look at the history. I mean, the law's bias didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was built brick by brick over centuries, as the entire concept of property was completely transformed.
This timeline shows a really profound shift. Back in medieval times, land wasn't just a thing you owned. It was tied to your community, your status, your obligations. But then came the enclosures. This was a long, often violent period where common lands were fenced off and privatized. All of a sudden, people who had lived and worked at land for generations were redefined as trespassers, and that's the moment land becomes an abstract commodity, and the law evolves to protect it, leading to our modern system where property rights are often treated as the most sacred right of all.
And that brings us to this absolutely crucial point from the great political economist Karl Polanyi. The free market wasn't some peaceful, natural evolution. It was created. It was constructed using both legal and physical force. Things that were never meant to be sold, like land, labor, and even money, had to be violently ripped out of their social context and turned into commodities. And the law was the main tool used to do it.
Okay, so let's take that historical bias and see how it's baked right into our modern legal system. And there is no better example, really, than bankruptcy law. It reveals a stark, two-tiered system of justice.
So we have this idea of bankruptcy, right? It's supposed to be a lifeline for people who are just drowning in debt, a way to get a fresh start. But what if it actually works in two completely different ways depending on who you are?
I mean, just look at this table. It lays it out so clearly. For an individual, bankruptcy is often this bureaucratic nightmare filled with high fees and all sorts of hurdles. And crucial debts, like student loans, usually can't be discharged at all. But for a corporation, Chapter 11 is a strategic financial tool. It lets them wipe out debt, cut worker pensions, and shield executives from liability, like we saw with Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family during the opioid crisis.
And then there's this number, $1,500. That's roughly what it costs just to file for individual bankruptcy. Think about the cruel irony of that. The system designed to help people who have no money costs a ton of money just to access. It slams the door shut for the very people who need it the most.
And all of this, everything we've talked about so far, it brings us to the final stage of this evolution. This is where the logic of property reaches its absolute peak, the corporation becoming the most protected person in our entire society. Through these legal ideas like corporate personhood, these abstract, artificial entities have been granted the rights of living, breathing human beings. Rights like free speech, privacy, and due process. You can't put a corporation in jail, you can only fine it. They can pour unbelievable amounts of money into elections, and the law calls it speech.
This sentence right here, it just perfectly captures that final transformation. The legal system started out by protecting the assets of powerful people. And now it has elevated the ultimate asset, the corporation, into a person itself. A person that often has more rights and way fewer responsibilities than any actual human being. So this leaves us with a pretty challenging thought to end on. If the scales of justice aren't balanced by design, if the courtroom really is a kind of theater that's set up to protect property above all else, then we have to ask ourselves a much, much bigger question. What would a system of real justice actually look like?